So the big question remains is what is your legacy, right? Biggest myth in India or even abroad is your nominee and legal heir are not the same thing. Whereas nominee is only a custodian, meaning they can only be the caretaker until the legal heir takes over. So 3% of India's wealth is lying unclaimed, and every year only 2% of that 3% is actually discovered by the family members.
And welcome to a brand new episode of Fintech Ki Baat Dil Se. Today we have with us Vishnu Chundi, founder and CEO of Aasaanwill. Let's take a step back here, right? Aasaanwill kind of touches into a realm of business that has hardly been covered in countries like India and most likely even abroad. And this business works in a realm that is even taboo to be talked about in certain families, and many families in India, right? The business is will making. I can't imagine a day when I can go and talk to my father and say, "Hey, आपने अपने will में क्या डाला है?" or "Have you sorted out your will?" That just becomes an awkward conversation because we've been raised in such a way, specifically in countries, Southeast Asian countries, and few other countries like that. Maybe I'm stereotyping. I think Vishnu will be able to give a better view on that, but that is what I feel, right? And the real problem arises is when you really don't know what essentially kind of assets, properties, and what kind of other liabilities your parent or loved one might have that you might end up inheriting. At point of time in your life when you're losing your parent, it's already as difficult as it gets, right? And at that point of time, you don't want to struggle with the problems of dealing with the legalities of properties and assets and trying to run around patching all those things up, right? So that is where essentially Aasaanwill comes in and tries to create a one-stop solution to kind of account for it all and make it a lot more handy. Having said that, let's take a step back and welcome Vishnu to the show. Hey Vishnu, thank you so much for joining us. It's a pleasure having you here.
Likewise, Namaste. Good to see you here, Shreyas.
Great. Having said that, Vishnu, before we dive into the world of will making, let's take a step back and talk a bit about yourself. A brief intro, right? I've gone through your LinkedIn profile a couple of times and I've stalked you, but would love to hear a bit about you, your days in London Business School at Bain, and your journey throughout.
Yeah, I'll keep it super brief. So I'm originally from Hyderabad, land of biryani, and then did my undergrad at BITS Pilani. I'm a bit of a physics nerd, so I studied physics and electrical engineering. And immediately after BITS, I got a chance to begin my career with Bain & Company in India. And it was an interesting experience for someone like me to understand the world of business, naturally given the kind of work that Bain does, very high level strategic. So that was my baby step into the world of business acumen. After that, one of my all-time heroes is Professor Stephen Hawking, and I wanted to study at his college at the University of Cambridge. It's called Trinity Hall. It's a cute college, very old. And I left Bain to go to the UK to read an MPhil in nanotechnology. And I met Professor Hawking a few times. It's one of those memories that I'll take with me to my grave, so to speak. And after that, I started my career in London at the UK's first Fintech unicorn, a company that was doing buy now, pay later stuff. And I was employee number probably 20 first product managers in the team. We grew to 3,000 people. I launched products for them in Spain, South Africa, Poland, Canada, and even India. And at this point, I figured, okay, now I have built enough of my pieces of the puzzle for me to try and take entrepreneurship myself, to take that plunge. So at that point, I decided, why don't I start a company And like most Indians with a lot of time, I also applied to business school, and I figured my logic at that time was I'll utilize the 2 years at B school to turn an entrepreneur, and which is exactly what I did. So right from day one, I put a team together from my Wonga and Cambridge experience, my network, applied to LBS, got in, and then within the first year, we went into Techstars London, which is like one of this world's premier accelerator programs. And yeah, since then, I've been on an incredible entrepreneurial journey. The Asset Vault, which is the name of the company, the headquartered. And yeah, that's in a nutshell the journey to the beginning of the company.
Great. That sounds like an incredible experience that you have had so far, from Bitch to Bain to Cambridge, and then building your own companies, right? I think that's amazing. So what, you were there in Bain, you worked with one of the first fintech unicorns in UK. So what essentially inspired you to get into entrepreneurship? I mean, why entrepreneurship?
Yeah, I think in 2008, when I was finishing my undergrad, I wanted to do something on my own. And this was in India where I think it was still, you didn't have a lot of entrepreneurial role models. Still the best way to acquire Lakshmi was through Saraswati, if you know what I mean. And at the same time, I also knew my shortcomings. I don't come from a business background. Like purely, it's a very academic, classic, upper middle class background, I would say. So I knew that I had to give myself some time to essentially add those skill sets before I could take the plunge. And I always, I'm a lifelong learner. I'm constantly seeking out knowledge, and I love universities. Contrary to most founders, I actually love going to classes. I've had some incredible professors at all my universities. I also spent half a year on exchange at UC Berkeley in the Silicon Valley during my MBA, just to understand the American culture of one, education, and also entrepreneurship. That was very different to the Indian and the European way of doing things. And now, I mean, during that time, I also ended up raising some money while I was there as an MBA exchange student. So overall, it's a personal journey of enrichment. But entrepreneurship, I think it started off as a curiosity thing. And then the more I started looking at the world, you can look at inefficiencies, and perhaps you feel, okay, maybe I can add a little bit of efficiency here and create value for a bunch of people, and then of course that can translate into greater value for everybody.
Interesting. That's really inspiring, I must say. So when you started your first company, and I think I have a bit of confusion here, right? So Asset Vault and Aasaanwill, are they the same entity? Are they the different entities, or is one a product and one is a brand?
Aasaanwill is the brand of Asset Vault, the company. And obviously, we also expanded to India. We started off in London, and then doing the very same thing. We were helping English people write wills and testaments. And the route to market there was much more B2B SaaS. So I was selling our product through local banks and insurance companies. In a post-COVID world, what I discovered was there was a lot of, I think, potential demand in the Indian ecosystem. Plus, there were a lot of changes happening in the UK. So I wanted to position the company in a direction where we could catch the tailwinds. Naturally, the India story was on the rise, but the UK story was sort of plateauing at that time. So that was also like another reason to look into markets where, I have some founder market fit, as you call it, or some unfair advantages. I couldn't go to China. I don't understand the landscape, but obviously Hindustan is our country. So that was how the segue happened. One is the brand.
Got it. So let's take a step back here. Let's talk about your journey of building Asset Vault in UK, London, and the differences or the contrasts of building a startup in India that you experienced now that you are in India.
Yeah, so it's very different. I think one it's a completely different consumer behavior, totally different world that we are now living in from a lot of the parameters that one is expected to now look at. But I think one other thing that I have noticed is it's also your timing. Most companies, I think, need to get the timing right. And some of these things are obviously within your control, others not so much in your control, depending on how the macro economy also does.
Right.
So, with the Indian audience, India is a very diverse country, and there, like my mother tongue is Telugu. I do speak Hindi. Thanks to Aasaanwill, I managed to now read and write Urdu as well. In the last year and a half, I have probably spoken to Indians from all age groups, genders, religions, castes. I have a deep understanding now of how does the average Indian citizen look at their total wealth, their total net worth, and how do they want to give it to the next generation. And it is very different. This is the most personal, confidential conversation you can have with somebody and understand how they think about what does legacy mean to them. Think about it, right? Like a Telugu person who's like 70 years old versus like a Gujarati person who's 60 years old, men and women, very different. And once you start, this is the I think to answer your question, India is incredibly diverse. Very few products will give you an opportunity to truly understand how Indians think. And very few products have such a lasting impact on your life. Because you write a will today, there are families that I know will thank Aasaanwill 30 years from now. Because we just have saved them so much heartache. So their kids, like literally brothers, will be together because of our product. Right. Whereas in most other products, the impact of the benefit does not last like beyond maybe 6 months, 1 year if you're very lucky, right? Like it won't go beyond like a generation. So that is another thing that I have discovered while working here in India.
Of course. And if I take a step back here and talk about the consumer behavior, how differently are the Indian consumers driven from the UK consumers, right? What takes them? Like, for example, it is a commonly held conception, I would say, I would not call it a misconception, that Indian consumer is very price sensitive, as well as they don't really want to compromise too much on quality. So, what would be a statement that kind of fits the UK consumers similarly, and how do you differentiate those from Indian consumers?
I think it's very hard to be precise when we are talking in general terms, right? Because I think the stereotype is the Indian consumer is highly value conscious, whereas the Western consumer, if you convince them, they'll probably pay you the money. But it really depends on the product and the context. And if you look at the classic consumer buying behavior, where they are in that funnel, are they still in decision, shopping around? Do they have a pronounced need of the problem? Do they perceive that yes? So we have to unfortunately get very precise about the use case. But if I just focus it on succession planning, I think Indians are now becoming aware. I mean, I have personally helped hundreds of families write their first will and testament. I think it's a conversation that needs to be had because it is very fundamental to our existence. Because one thing is for sure, whether it's you or me or anybody else who's listening to the podcast, we are all here as temporary guests. Nobody's going to stay permanently. And you only have to go to any old monument, look at any history book to appreciate that all the kings of the old kings and queens of the old year have gone to Bhagwan or Khuda.
Right.
So the big question remains is, what is your legacy, right? Now, obviously, so we want to enable you to do the right thing for your family. Because the will is not a product that you write for yourself. It's like term life insurance. You are already gone. It is for your family. And if you want to make life easier for them, especially at a time of bereavement, and preserve your family relationships, then taking a stitch in time now would save 9 in the future. So that I think is the mindset. And now I think post-COVID, everybody is really appreciative of this, right? Like we are, I don't know about you, but if everybody is like, oh, if this day is precious, let me actually appreciate my here and now. Who knows in the future, like we can't take things for granted anymore.
Got it. Perfect. So let's switch this up a notch, right? Let's talk a bit more about your journey of building Aasaanwill. When essentially you were building Asset Vault in UK, what was that moment when you realized that this is going to work? I mean, this is the solution that everyone needs, and this is going to work.
I think COVID definitely made a huge spike in that because, and again, so far, we've only looked at succession planning in one lens, which is what happens when I die. But there's actually several good reasons to think about it in a more positive light. And this is what I want to bring to the people's, especially young people like yourself, right? So, biggest myth in India or even abroad is your nominee and legal heir are not the same people. I'll give you an example that is legal speak. Let me bring it to life with a simple example. And this is like, I'm talking about one of India's most prestigious Fintech persons. And I was talking to her and she said, hey, I have a mutual fund account. I made my father the nominee of the account 10 years ago. And he's really, he's my hero. He's helped invest in my education and I want his retirement years to be taken care of. Then I asked her, are you married? And she said, yes, I've been married for 7 years now. Now, according to the law, and I asked her, do you have a will? Naturally, and she said, no, I don't. I haven't written it yet. She's still in her 40s. And that's when I had to educate her that if you are a Hindu married woman in India, all of your self-acquired property, in the absence of a will, when you die, goes to your husband and your children equally. Most people would not know this, and most people are forced in the world of fintech, which is what your audience cares about, forced to appoint nominees. I'm sure you appointed nominees for your bank accounts, your FDs, your locker, your demat account, your mutual fund.
True.
But most people in their head, they think nominee will get the asset. If that is the intent, that is not how it's going to happen. It obviously depends on the type of asset class we're talking about, but generally, legal heir is somebody who can consume the asset. That person can spend or consume the asset. Whereas nominee is only a custodian, meaning they can only be the caretaker until the legal heir takes over. So coming back to the example I gave, the father will purely operate the mutual fund account, give it to the son-in-law in this case, 50%. And if there are children, the remaining 50% goes to all the kids together. Now, the big question that I usually ask, especially the working women of India is, did you know this? And number two, who is going to take care of your parents? Because the son-in-law can get married again. Let's say, which is what is happening, right? So fundamentally, what I have also noticed is the Indian social fabric is changing. And you are probably feeling this right now, Shreyas. The India from 2005 to India of 2025 is completely different. There's not much difference between us and any other developed economy, right? And I'll give you examples. It is the increasing rate of working women in India. It is the increasing number of people or families moving away from combined families to nuclear families. People extending marriages longer. People cohabiting before getting married. All of this has a direct impact on your inheritance, on your succession laws, because the laws were made in 1956, inspired by an 18th century British Act, inspired by the Moses' 10th commandment, which is 5,000 years old. How will the modern 2023 India fit into those old school norms? You are fundamentally challenging everything. That is what I've observed now.
Got it. Having said that, right, coming back to the fundamental question that I asked, so when was it that you realized that this startup is actually going to work for you?
Right? I don't think you wake up. Yeah, I don't think, to be fair, if I'm honest, like you don't. get this, like, it's not like a Buddha moment where I get enlightened under the Bodhi tree and like, yes, I have got it. This startup will work. I hope it was as easy as that. But yeah, COVID, what it did was I actually helped a lot of my, and this is like, yeah, maybe if I with your question, I'm thinking back. I actually helped parents of my batchmates because I was in India at the time when they lost their loved ones. So I was the one essentially getting them the medicine. There was always like, if you remember the craziness in like wave 1 and wave 2, hospital beds were not available, kids were stuck abroad. Because I was physically here, whatever I could do, I did. And unfortunately, some of them actually passed away. Then you enter into this incredible bureaucratic quagmire of death certificate, open nominee, and the person is not in India or they're not in a position to travel. You will see that like even now, like people's assets are stuck. It won't come into them anytime in the next couple of years.
Right.
There's 1.5 lakh crores of unclaimed wealth lying stuck in Indian bank accounts, insurance policies, provident funds, mutual funds, you name it. This is a pre-Fintech India. Let me fast forward this by 10 years. 2033, this is the time, same conversation, 1.5 lakh crores would probably have become 5 lakh crores because everything is now digital. Kids have no clue what the sons or daughters have invested. Children have no clue what the parents have invested in. Everything goes into an inbox with multi-factor authentication. Like I'm sure your folks do not have 100% visibility into your portfolio, right? It's not something that they would know automatically. So 3% of India's wealth is lying unclaimed, and every year only 2% of that 3% is actually discovered by the family members. RBI has opened an account called DEAF, Depositors Education and Awareness Fund. That itself is growing at 40% CAGR. Basically, this is this one residuary bucket where all the unclaimed money goes and lies. So you should look this up. It's insane, like what's happening. So nobody is talking about this.
Got it. Perfect. Anyways, having said that, let's move on to the next piece of this segment as such. It's always, being, at least what I've observed, it's always been understood that being a startup founder is a lot difficult than being working in a 9-to-5 job, and it's always really stressful on your mental health, physical health, and all of that. Having said that, since you have been a founder for almost 7.5 years, how do you manage to, how do you manage that stress, and how do you kind of stay on top of things, right? Is there any specific devices that you use, as in any specific techniques that you use as such, not a gadget as such, but self-discipline device or something like that you use to stay sane?
Firstly, I don't understand what stress you're talking about. Like, I've never been more relaxed in my life.
That's good to hear.
No, I'm kidding. I think it's just like any other job. You do have stresses, and to be fair, being a founder has its own type of stress, but most professionals, everybody has stress, right? Like, I think it is not the only sole territory of startup people. Having said that, I think what worked for me is, I think a lot of philosophy, if I'm really honest. And I come from a very technical and business background. So in the last 3 years, thanks to COVID, I gave myself a classics education. In Indian philosophy, Western philosophy, you were stuck reading books. And I think all of these, and fundamentally what I've discovered is whatever we are going through people have already experienced it. They've come up with an answer. It's called wisdom. If you read it, you can try and apply some of it. So one practical thing that I discovered is the Greeks, like the Stoics. It's becoming popular these days also in pop culture. Basically, in a nutshell, you do everything, and it's also the same thing or very similar things that the Bhagavad Gita says when it comes to Nishkam Karma, because you cannot make your life at the mercy of the result always. You have to trust in the process, and most stress goes away when you are putting in your 100%, doing in the right thing with the process, because that's what you can control. It's like that classic Arjuna conversation, right? I can see the eye and hit the eye. But Arjuna can't control like the god of wind, Pavan. Anything can happen, right? And this has happened again in Ramayana, Lord Ram hits, but then Hanuman has to intervene and help him with the final little direction control. So focus on the journey. Obviously give your best and improve your skill when you're doing what you're doing, which is what yoga means. It's the karmasu kaushalam, they say, right? Like it's the improvement of your skill. So that sort of helps. And also obviously try and do something that energizes you. I discovered like I like to acquire knowledge, so I learned a new language during those crazy COVID years. So now I can read and write Urdu and Farsi, which is incredible. Like it was Chinese to me. and so suddenly when you do that, you feel, oh wow, this is a whole new dimension that you explore about yourself, which takes your interest off.
Interesting. No, I think that is, necessary. I think picking up a few hobbies as well as stoicism. I don't know how much it will help or how much actually it helps, but I'll take a word for it. I think it should probably, be helpful to kind of detach yourself a bit, emotionally from the outcomes that essentially present once you have done the work, right? As you rightly said, there is also a text that says karam kar and phal ki chinta mat kar, that kind of a thing as well.
That's an Indian philosophy. Actually, the last philosophy is this. Remember, we're all going to die. In the words of the great Carl Sagan, we are just a pale blue dot in the overall universe. Nobody's going to care what you... it's nice to do good things in the world. But don't take too much stress, because one day सबको छोड़ के जाना है. Alexander भी गए, Julius Caesar गए, Shahjahan गए, सब जाना.
Right.
So don't make your every day here and now. I know it's a very serious thing to be saying like on a Saturday morning here, but it is the reality. This is like the timeless thing, right? Don't take too much unnecessary stress. Take care of your parents. Do the right thing in your role, which is again Indic philosophy, right? Like the duty, dharma of your situation.
Right.
And uske baad, just leave it to, if you believe in a God, leave it to God or whatever. Leave it to effort.
Got it. No, I think, and the reason why I always ask these questions to all the founders, right, is specifically, I've had a lot of conversations with founders and they've come and told me, yaar, startup mein itna I've got involved that I've forgotten about everything else. Like, family is always complaining about time, friends, so I don't even remember when the last time I spoke to them and went out to them. It's always the company that's going on in my head, and it's always the work that's always going on in my head, and I'm not able to switch it off, right? So that's the reason, essentially, why we try to understand what essentially a lot of successful founders do to kind of disconnect from that stress or that constant train of thoughts that goes on in your mind about work. And I think you have answered it really well. Thanks a lot for that. Having said that, moving on to the last question of this segment before we segue into the next segment, Dande Ki Baat. The final question is essentially, what is the biggest mistake that you have ever made as a founder, and how did you kind of recover from it?
I think my biggest mistake is yet to come, inshallah. So, abhi छोटे mistakes क्या है? But I mean, you do mistakes every day, right? Like, so biggest to mushkil hai, because this is the other weird thing about being a founder. I'm sure that you've got the roller coaster analogy now beaten to death. तो मेरा mistake मतलब अभी mistake लग सकता है. Actually, pre-stoic Vishnu and post-stoic Vishnu अभी सब become like the lotus leaf, right? जो पानी में है लेकिन it doesn't get wet. So now I don't see those sine waves going like crazy highs and insane troughs. It's more or less एक signal पकड़ लिया उसने. तो
settle down to a mellow.
क्योंकि because you're now used to well, I think every founder goes through that initially, like the first times around when you're learning to ride a bicycle also. Until the side wheels come off, you're like थोड़ा क्या हो रहा है, ये left को right को जा रहा है. बाद में like this is how you learn.
Right.
गिर गिर 2-3 बार साइकिल से कुछ नहीं होगा. You pick yourself up and you dust yourself. फिर से शुरू कर.
Perfect. I think that covers it all. Thank you so much, Vishnu, for all your insights and wisdom.